Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear Prime Minister, dear Excellencies, dear fellow academics, dear journalists, dear guests. My name is Marek Tamm. I'm Professor of History in Tallinn University, and on behalf of the organizers of this conference, I'm most genuinely happy to greet you in Tallinn, in this very place called the Creative Hub, Kultuurikatel in Estonian. As you all know, Estonia has a privilege from July till December 2017 to hold the presidency for the Council of European Union. And on this occasion, Estonia, and again this very venue, has hosted and will host a great many of European leaders, of high officials, as well as many events, conferences, seminars, gatherings. And therefore, indeed, one might ask, why to have yet another conference on Europe, especially an academic one? I think the question points to a fundamental paradox in regard to the European Union. Because I think we all do agree that, on the one hand, the European Union is something unprecedented in human history. It's a highly original enterprise. I would say a political phenomenon of world historical importance. Even I would argue that the very existence of the European Union, its integration, its expansion, calls into question many of the usual political concepts we have used to make sense of the political life, like sovereignty, like national state, like legitimacy, and so on and so forth. But then, on the other hand, we have to admit that for many people, the European Union is not associated with those unprecedented world historical phenomena. It looks quite boring, actually. It's a lot of bureaucracy. It's this somehow remote, neutral, anonymous. And my question is, why the intellectual appeal of European Union is so limited? Of course, I am exaggerating. Many of you in this room have contributed to make European Union intellectually appealing. But I think the question remains, what should be done to make European Union intellectually exciting again? And I hope at least, that this very question, which is, I believe, the driving force behind this conference, will be one of our guides or main ideas during those 2 days. But now, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I'm extremely happy to give the floor to the Prime Minister of Estonia, Mr. Jüri Ratas. Please.
Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am very happy to welcome you all in Tallinn today. This conference has brought together an impressive group of academics, policymakers, journalists to take a look at Europe's horizon and imagine the future and our ways ahead. It is a great honor to have all of you here today. Honorable participants, when Estonia started with the preparations for the presidency term, Europe was at the crossroads facing quite difficult times. However, over the past years, we have together overcome a number of different crises. I am pleased that today the atmosphere is more positive and we are catching the favorable winds. If you allow me a brief reference to Mr. Juncker's recent State of the Union address. As the presidency of the Council of the European Union, Estonia is honored to have the opportunity to contribute to a more dynamic and innovative Europe. With our unique expertise on the digital arena, Estonia aims to be the flagship that leads Europe into the digital future. I fully agree with President Macron that the digital transformation is one of the two great transformations that we are now living through. The other one being the climate change. Like with climate change, there is a sense of urgency to act. Europe can only lead when she herself is a leader in a digital and not a follower. For that reason, only 10 days ago, Tallinn held its first digital summit, where 25 heads of the state and government discussed the digital future here in Europe. We want to take part in the ongoing broader debate of the future of the EU, as we strive to improve the daily lives of our citizens and create new perspective for our companies. Honorable audience, at this conference we will talk of the concept of nation states or member states. It is an important topic for Europe, as the rise of nationalism has been a much debated trend over recent years. In times, it has come hand in hand with anti-EU sentiment, populist and extremist views. Nevertheless, there should be no either-or choice between being an European and being an Estonian, or Italian, Irish, Polish, and so on. The EU consists of 28, unfortunately soon 27 member states that are all nation states as well. It is an important topic for Estonia, as only 20 years ago, Estonia were dreaming of and working hard to achieve membership in the Union. Now we are a dedicated member state while also remaining a nation state. The citizens of Estonia are at the same time citizens of the EU. Even so, fitting together these two tasks, leading a nation state and being a member state of a deeply integrated union, is not always easy. But it is the only way forward for Europe and its states, because united we are always stronger. Our motto for the Estonian presidency is unity through balance. Although the Union consists of different nation states, we share the same values and have more similarities than we might think. Europe first and foremost is a union of like-minded states united in our shared commitment to the founding values of the EU. This does not mean leaving behind what makes us unique. Rather, we must find a balance between new and conventional, risky and safe, economic, social and environmental, big and small, north and south, east and west. To find balance in Europe today, as the member states remain two main drivers of European integration, it does not need to be a choice between the nation and the union. Let me conclude by wishing you all a very interesting conference and a memorable stay here in Estonia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister, for those very kind and interesting words. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm most pleased to introduce our first keynote speaker. Giuliano Amato is a legend in Italian and European politics. He has served twice as Prime Minister of Italy. He has been for 18 years member of the Italian Parliament, and also he was the vice president of the Convention of Europe for Future in the early 2000s. But Giuliano Amato has also a very strong and important academic background. He was for many years professor of comparative constitutional law at the University of Rome and many other important major universities. He's also currently Professor Emeritus of the European University Institute in Florence and author of almost more than 30 books on various topics, including constitutional law and European integration. So now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Giuliano Amato.
Pleasure to meet you. Very nice of you. Well, good afternoon. Excellent for the Estonian presidency to give us the opportunity to discuss the past and the present and the future of our union. And my starting point will be exactly the same that Prime Minister Ratas was dealing with, the relationship between national identities and the Union. National identities have never been antagonist to, in principle, to our political integration. Also, the founding fathers of the community at the time, also Altiero Spinelli and the other authors of the Ventotene Manifesto, were not against national states. They were against the exclusivity of national sovereignties that had led to conflicts without other solution but weapons and wars. In other words, they wanted no more wars among us. And this sort of missionary purpose did not imply the disappearance of our nation states. It implied the willingness by them to put some of their functions together and to create a superior entity which was not supposed to supersede the states, nor to eliminate our diversities, our cultures, our languages, our constitutional settings, our national constitutional settings. Our motto was due, not everybody is aware of it, was due to a students' competition of the European Parliament in the year 2000. And it was a group of students winning that competition that gave us the motto, united in our diversities. My God, this is exactly what we were and are supposed to be. United in our diversities, not united because we eliminate our diversities. It wouldn't be Europe anymore. We would somehow waive our qualities, the value added precisely of our diversities. Joseph Weiler, a great American European citizen, because he is also an Italian citizen now, our former president, Brigid, wrote at the beginning of our experience that the Grundnorm of the European Union was the principle of mutual tolerance. And this is the sense of the Union. Due to our diversities, we had been fighting against each other. Wars had prevailed among us. The sense of the Union was not to eliminate our diversities, but to learn, each of us, how to appreciate our diversities, how to draw the common principles that necessarily our long history has nurtured in our different countries. And here, actually, you have the two pillars of our institutional construction. On the one side, the common constitutional traditions of the member states, which are the great reservoir of European rights. Most of the rights that we have as European citizens are not to be found in the treaties, quite obviously, but as the European Court of Justice has decided, in our national constitutional systems, whenever you draw out of them common constitutional traditions, and common constitutional traditions do exist. And this is where from also the Charter of the European Fundamental Rights of the year 2000 was somehow drawn. The initial construction was a very clever one because it gave superiority, but not supremacy, to the European level. Consider these two elements. On the one side, the Commission, which has the European interest as its mission, its basic interest. Due to this, the Commission has the monopoly of the legislative proposal in the initial community system, but it has remained. The Council of Ministers decides eventually, and therefore adapts to the national interests that are represented by the members of the Council, the initial proposal, which is supposed to be based on the European interest only. But in order to amend the proposal of the Commission, the states have to agree with each other. Unanimity is needed to approve an amendment against the initial proposal. So it's a very delicate balance. This superiority of the European interest does not exclude national interests, but require national interests to find a common ground to adapt the proposal of the Commission. So this is another essential element. And in time, we also adopt the principle, don't forget, of mutual recognition. The principle of mutual recognition implies that there are diversities among us, also in legal rules. But it also implies that there is a common texture, a common platform, and as long as this common platform is complied with, differentiations can be accepted and can be part of the European legal order. Of course, this delicate balance did not exclude that the process of closer integration could somehow take place. And it took place, and we reached the point which goes beyond the standards of any international organization of having a parliament directly elected by the citizens, which was something that gave our union a sort of dual identity, both international and constitutional. Still within the initial balance, however, and despite the parliament directly elected, despite the fact, very important, that further pieces of legislation went to co-decision with the parliament, which meant went to the majority voting. And majority voting makes an important difference in terms of strengthening the links, the mutual links of the members. As long as I want on something unanimity, I don't really feel at home in the community where we vote, because I'm wary of the decision of the others without my vote. I want my vote to be essential. If I accept the majority voting, it means that at least for the areas where the majority voting applies, I feel confident that whatever the decision, my interests one way or another are protected. So my community links in this case are clearly stronger. But the balance was not changing. And if somebody tried to say now we have a supremacy of the community system vis-à-vis national systems, the answer was no. In the States, they have supremacy. In the European community and then Union, we have primacy, which is a different thing. And not only for legal scholars like us. It is a different thing because it implies that the primacy of community law and of community decision is recognized and accepted only in the areas where the competence to decide has been transferred to the superior level. And the court said since the beginning, quite rightly, it would be pointless for you states to transfer a competence to a superior level and then to keep exercising that competence at the national level, creating different legislations in different member states. It would be a stupid mess. Making it pointless for you what you have decided. So the effect utile of the transfer. But this is primacy. There is no primacy beyond the powers that are conferred. At the turn of the century, it seemed that times could be ripe for going further. And the protagonist of the European scene became the Constitution. I played that round. I must say that I'd never been convinced that a constitution could come out of that convention. Now, also because it was a constitutional treaty. So it was very ambiguous since the beginning. It was both. It was supposed to be a constitution and supposed to be a treaty. So there was an ambivalent kind of. Second, because at the end of our works, the basic ingredients of a constitution were still missing, because primacy was still primacy, had not become supremacy. Please compare the supremacy clause of the US Constitution and the clause on primacy of our treaty. There is an enormous difference. I just underline one. In the supremacy clause, you read that the Constitution and the laws approved pursuant to it will prevail, whatever in the constitutions and laws of the member states to the contrary. Now, on the basis of Article 4 of our treaty, the article that protects national identity and its consequent features, should a European act, although adopted within a competence of the European Union, violate fundamental features of one of the member states, the Bundesverfassungsgericht, the Italian Constitutional Court, the Polish Constitutional Court, and others have already said that at that point counter limits would be raised. Right, wrong, it's not for me to say it now. I say that this is our situation at the moment, and actually I defined this situation already at the end of the works of the Convention in terms of this is not a female, as some of us were hoping. You know that constitution in some of our languages is a she, and treaty is a he. Not all the languages are neutral here. Italians and French have the fantasy of using also male and female in these matters. So, constitution is beautiful and is female. Treaty, sort of ugly creature, is a male. And I hoped it to be a female. I had to admit at the conclusion it is a hermaphrodite. And I said in a conference in Cambridge a couple of years later on, which is published in the Cambridge Law Yearbook, that we should learn how to make the life of a hermaphrodite happy, because also hermaphrodites have a right to be happy. And therefore improving the functionality, the efficiency of the hermaphrodite without expecting it to become necessarily a beautiful young girl. Also because the Bundesverfassungsgericht is right when they decided in the Lisbon Treaty Urteil that we are free to go federal. But if we want to go federal, we have to change our national constitutions, because our national constitutions don't go beyond a union of states in the authorization they give us to work for European integration. And here I have to rush toward my conclusion. How many minutes do I have? 4 or 5. Your hand was uncertain. I take it as a 5. No, also because, no, I don't remember, okay. No, because there is still room in a union of states for integrating areas of our activity. Be careful. And what has been happening in the latest years is a sort of pendulum swinging dangerously toward the opposite side, opposite to integration. So at the moment, we are too much on the side of the member states for at least a couple of main reasons. One is institutional. After Maastricht, after the room of the intergovernmental method, the European Council has been deciding much more than it was supposed to do, and it has been deciding perceived as the member states in joint session taking the decision. No responsibility of the European Council toward the European Parliament. Necessarily, the reaction is, if I want a more democratic process, I involve my national parliament. And therefore, for European decisions taken by the highest European body, we only have the intervention of national parliaments, of the Bundestag, to authorize the German government to do this and that, and to increase the resources for this or for that, and other parliaments following this example. There is something that doesn't work here, because at least in the area of European decisions, the circuit of political responsibility should be European. But even more than that, the demand of protection by my state in relation to issues that are pan-European, the economy, migration, terrorism. More and more we see populist movements that want a return to the states. This is dangerously on the side of the states, and I say dangerously because, rationally speaking, we understand that, let's say, let me give you this example that for an Italian is quite important. In the Eurozone area, austerity, should we have austerity? Should we ignore austerity? It's quite a silly discussion. If your debt is too high, you have to readjust your public finances. There is no way out, and it is your responsibility. But the question is, should also your economy be destroyed by the fact that you are involved in financial readjustment? Answers that you receive from other systems are, let us take the states. Okay, Wisconsin has to take care of its own debt, full stop. But there are grants coming from the federal level that keep the economy of that member state alive. Now, this is something that we have always been missing in the Eurozone. My state was engaged in financial readjustment. At the European level, nothing was done. While now, in the last document of the Commission on the future of the Eurozone, you have a stabilization function to be exercised at the European level, pouring resources in the economy of the member states, not to repay their debt, but to keep the economy alive, which means using the two levels of governments for cyclical and anti-cyclical measures at the same time. This is something that we need. This is an integration that we need. This is something that we all understand. We can't run the Eurozone efficiently with some more integration, which is inside the Eurozone. At the same time, in defense and security, necessarily we will need some more integration among those of our member states who have the necessary resources to do it, mostly with America doing what it is doing. So what am I envisaging? I'm envisaging what Vivian Schmidt, an excellent, not legal scholar, this is an advantage of her, not legal scholar, the multi-cluster Europe. So Europe remains a union of states, but in different areas, not necessarily the same states, but also different states, engage into processes of further integration aiming at specific functions and missions. Migration migration, necessarily some of the southern countries should integrate with each other, which not necessarily involves countries that are not directly affected by this phenomenon. Migration, terrorism, anti-terrorism, Eurozone, defense and security. And you have these different areas in which Europe integrates, remaining a union of states. This is, I think, this is what we should offer our citizens now. Those who now say, why don't we convene a constitutional assembly and deciding to elect the European president? Honestly speaking, I mean, I'm friend of many of the potential candidates to this position, but is this really what European citizens now expect from us? Electing a president or having more delivery, having a more efficient Eurozone, having anti-terrorism and immigration really handled and governed? So when they tell you, but there is the democratic deficit, don't mind, is not necessarily on the side of input. I feel I need to elect somebody else, otherwise I'm not happy. No, democratic deficit is also on the side of the output. I need more delivery. I'd like Europe much more. Should Europe succeed in giving me something more? And this is the main problem we have, and I hope this is the problem we will solve. Finished. I don't leave the podium without some water.
You can
sorry for your minutes. It's done. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Amato. And it was a great introduction, and also very much on the following topic about integration, because now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to give you our next keynote speaker. Brigid Laffan is a professor and director at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. Before that, she was for many years professor at the University College Dublin. And I think she is the foremost expert in many European matters, but especially on European integration. And she has published widely on this topic, including from the Irish perspective. So we look very much forward to hear her reflections about the integration or disintegration of European Union. So please, Brigid, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here in Tallinn. I come from another small country on the extreme northwest, looking out onto the Atlantic, so a very different perspective because, as we know, particularly in Europe, geography matters. But I think it is important to think about, as small states, the importance that the EU gives small states in terms of having voice, rather than being subject to the whims and whims and power structures of the larger, more powerful states. And of course, when one sits round the table in Brussels or elsewhere, the German Chancellor is always the German Chancellor, but we should remember that balance of power in the 19th century was not good for small states. They were cut up, disposed of, and reimagined by people and didn't have voice. So we need, I think, there's sometimes a tendency for small states to think, oh, there's the weight of the large states. But I do think that broadly the EU is a very benign international system for small states. But what I want to talk about today is Europe disintegrating? Because I was asked to talk about this. And as you will see as I go on, I will argue that there's no systemic disintegration. But I will take seriously the forces within the EU that make the binding of this system extremely difficult. Scholars have known from the 1960s onwards that there were disintegrative phenomena associated with integration, that integration was never smooth or linear from autonomy and sovereignty to integration. The EU has always been subject to fits and starts, to shocks, to crises. And we know from Stanley Hoffmann onwards, his insight, that integration is often in the play of much larger external forces. So disintegration or integration by definition is not linear, and disintegration is the opposite to integration. It is, instead of ever closer union, it's ever more disunion. It is rather than integration and cooperation and coupling, it's uncoupling, it's the breaking apart, it's fragmentation. And in terms of looking at what disintegration might mean conceptually, we need to think firstly of systemic disintegration. And we know that polities and empires have collapsed in the past. We know in the near neighborhood here, this country, in fact, is the result of the collapse of one large multinational state. But there is also lower levels of disintegration, and I would distinguish between the functional and the territorial. I will also, I think, in today's Europe, we must think seriously and more seriously about value disintegration. And given events in Catalonia, we must also think seriously about what happens our Europe when member states themselves begin to disintegrate. So what is the evidence of disintegration in the EU as we see it today? Well, there certainly were powerful functional policy pressures during the crises of the last 10 years. If one read the Financial Times, as one had to in those times of trouble every morning, there was always a bet on what the prospect for the collapse of the euro was. And it often hovered around 55%. In other words, those looking at this currency union thinking that the stress that it was under, both from the markets and from politics, was such that it simply couldn't survive. As we know, it so far has survived, and what one might have anticipated was that the strain would have been sufficient to require the exit of one country, and Greece is the obvious candidate for exit, but that didn't happen either. And it didn't happen because what we learned during the crisis is that you can, with some optimism, go into a currency union. You can construct an economic and monetary union, however unbalanced, but you have great difficulty disentangling that system. It would have been, the collapse of the Eurozone would have been not a European financial crisis, it would have been a global financial crisis. And because of that, it has survived to date. Of course, the history of currency unions is that they don't necessarily survive forever. So I would never predict, but for now, there are extraordinarily strong pressures to ensure that the euro survives, is rebuilt and repaired. Schengen came under extraordinary pressure because of the nature and scale and volume of mobility, the refugee crisis, and it came under particular pressure in 2015 and is still, in my view, under pressure. But the functional policy, those two areas so far have not entirely disintegrated. We see territorial disintegration in the form of Brexit. The decision by a large and significant European state to seek exit from the system rather than voice within the system. And that's both a dramatic event, it's a significant event, and it will have profound consequences, and is having profound consequences, particularly for the United Kingdom, but in my view also for the EU. But paradoxically, Brexit itself is having an impact on the EU 27, and in my view, when when one sees the negotiations on Brexit, it is a reminder to the other member states of how difficult it is to disentangle 44 years of integration economically, legally, and politically. And so, paradoxically, Brexit, in fact, has had the opposite effect on the EU. Member state secession. The EU can accommodate, with great ease in my view, the independence of part of a member state, provided that is by agreement with the home state, with the major state itself. But unless there is agreement, and in this case this means Spain, with Catalonia on independence, then this will be an extremely conflictual and profoundly dangerous development. Why? Because constitutionally, what happened in Catalonia, it's unconstitutional, not just in terms of the Spanish constitution, but the Catalan constitution. And if Catalonia has a UDI and exits, then it will experience quite a reaction from Spain. But in turn, Spain would veto membership of Catalonia. So without agreement on both sides, this is extremely dangerous, and I see no evidence that agreement would be forthcoming. Scotland was a different situation, again, although there were major questions about Scottish membership of the EU in the event of a victory for the independence vote, the referendum, but at least there it was with the agreement of London, and it was under legislation from the House of Commons. So a very, very different experience. And finally, another element of disintegration, and that is disintegration of the founding values of the EU. Probably as dangerous for the EU as Brexit, and some would argue more dangerous, is what is happening in terms of the rule of law, both in Hungary and Poland. This is something that the EU cannot tolerate. And of course, people will argue that you can't use any coercive power, you can't withdraw structural funds or whatever. But if this continues, where the rule of law and the constitutions of those countries are undermined and their legal and judicial systems are undermined, this is something that the EU and the other member states cannot ignore, because you will eat the system from the inside out. If Brexit is a rupture in terms of you're losing part of the system, the authoritarians within and the values are, it's the lack of an agreement on how you govern in terms of the rule of law is extremely dangerous and damaging. I would conclude by saying, despite all of these strains and stresses in the EU system, that there is no systemic disintegration at the moment. The EU is robust enough to survive these pressures and tensions, because the EU has always been subject to tremendous tension. There's always been tension and integration between public power, in other words, the power of law and constitutions, as described by Giuliano Amato, and markets. And the EU struggles to contain. We understood in the euro crisis, the EU struggled to contain the behaviour of financial institutions in the absence of European-level supervision. There are now the same sorts of issues about taxing large American multinational companies. Of course, there's always a tension between the national and the European, because every European member state would like most autonomy for itself and least autonomy for the others. In other words, it wants to bind the others and have autonomy for itself. But the bargain in being a member state and not a nation state is that in order to bind others, you agree to be bound yourself. But that binding can range from being comfortable on a lot of issues to being extremely uncomfortable on a lot of issues. And every member state has its set of neuralgic issues that is set off by the dynamic of European integration. The third ties and tensions is always again between the EU and the world beyond. Europe lives in a world that is highly connected and globalized, and there are dynamics from the external world that challenge Europe and European integration. And then there's also that tension between our idea of the EU as a polity, a political system in the making, with all that we imagine that should be, and then as a problem-solving arena, as the place where the member states go to try to solve problems that they can no longer solve on their own. I would end this section by saying there's only one European Union. And what do I mean by that? The EU is all of the time faced with two challenges. The challenge on the one hand from the maximalists who say the EU isn't quite what it could be, should be, will be. And then those that say the EU is leeching member states of all of their power. In other words, the EU can often be subject to strain from both those, what I would call hyper-federalism on the one hand, and Euroscepticism on the other. But what we've learned from the crisis, I think we've learned over the last 10 years, I would argue that the EU is a robust and resilient system of multi-level governance. If it wasn't robust and resilient, it could not have survived the Eurozone crisis or the more recent refugee crisis. So, in terms of a set of governance structures and capabilities, with all of the problems identified, institutional and other. But what we have on the other side of the equation is extremely weak multi-level politics. Why? Because today, and still today, domestic politics trumps EU multi-level politics. We take our national elections more seriously than we do European elections. They're second order. Our Europeans don't turn out in large numbers for those Euro elections. So it's extremely difficult for citizens to have voice, adequate voice in the EU system, and extremely difficult for the EU to be responsive to citizens. And it's always the filter through the member states. Now, that's, in my view, structural. It's not accidental, it's structural. And there's no obvious solution in that the EU at some level suffers from a politics trap. But it's something that one needs to be attentive to. I would also say that if 2016 was the annus horribilis, the terrible year for the EU, with Brexit on the one hand and Trump on the other, something has turned this year. Now, Juncker calls it the wind in the sails. That might be a bit too optimistic, but something has definitely turned this year. And what has happened, I think, is that those who broadly think that the European Union is a good thing, those who broadly think that it fulfills an extremely important role in how we govern this part of the world, that pooling and sharing of sovereignty and interstate cooperation surrounded by a legal and constitutional system matters, and that its loss would be enormous. They have started to fight back. And if you look at the use of the European flag, during the crisis, this flag was burnt in anger in many of our cities. It was the symbol of austerity. It was the symbol of what was wrong. And now, there is a fight back, and that matters because politicization only of those who oppose European integration is extremely dangerous to the system. And of course, those who oppose tend to combine anti-migration, anti-EU in rather populist terms. And so there has to be a counterweight in domestic politics and in European politics to that. And that fight back, was perhaps symbolized more than anything else by Macron and his victory, that he was willing to fight a national election with the European flag, that he was willing to state what he was committed to. And that, in a sense, gave permission, because usually centrist politicians try to hide from Europe. They try to pretend that it's not an issue. They don't put it on the electoral agenda. They prefer to keep it back there. So I think that Europhiles fighting back, even, for example, in the United Kingdom, you see all of those marches now with people carrying the European flag. Now, I have some data, but I'm actually going to go ahead because there is no time. So where is the demand for integration coming from now? I would say, firstly, the shocks and shifts of global politics. That post-Trump, Merkel stated very clearly, we can no longer rely on our friends as we once did. And what she was basically saying there was that strong transatlantic axis that has been so important to this part of the world for so long was not as certain as it was in the past, because Trump is America first. Trump will do what Trump does in terms of the filter of a highly sovereigntist American first dynamic. And of course, with China, the question is competition and globalization. In the neighborhood, it's destabilization, both to the east, and you know far more about that than I do, but also the Mediterranean. But also, as I said earlier, Brexit itself has had an impact on not just on the governments of the 27, but on the peoples. If you look at the opinion polls, they're all trending in a somewhat different direction again. And then, of course, there's the internal EU dynamics that need attention. So the last speaker, Giuliano Amato, mentioned all of the things that I'm going to mention, but I do want to go back to the Macron speech. It is terribly long. And in my view, too long. It's an extraordinary menu. He has, I think in that, I lost count of the number of new institutions that Macron wanted to create. But what mattered about the speech is that he is prepared to argue for, to articulate, and to fight for European solutions to Europe's problems. And of course, the question then is, what will the response be from the other member states? But I think one of the sentences that, two of the sentences stood out for me. One, we have forgotten to stand up for Europe. And that, I think, is now happening in society. And the second is, I have no red lines, only horizons. In other words, I'm prepared to think about a project for the future. Now, all of the things, and the pressures are enormous in all of these areas, and no European state can engage with any of this on their own. Security and defense, the borders and values, the future, because it was something I'm acutely aware of since I moved to Italy 4 years ago, and that is the importance of what's happening in Africa to Europe. And that is not going to change. It's going to be that way for the next 50 years. So Europe has got to begin to address it in a really serious way. Also, climate change, the ecology, the digital technology. And I was also interested in the way everyone expected an EMU speech from him. In other words, his pitch for EMU. But he put EMU at the very end of the speech. And I think that's very wise, because what he's got to do in the first instance is he's got to convince Berlin that there is a grand bargain available again for the EU. And of course, the Franco-German relationship is not enough. As we all know, those of us in small countries, we do not want the future of Europe decided in an access from Berlin to Paris. But if those two countries cannot agree, nothing can be done. And so what happens, the Franco-German relationship in the next phase is extremely important. It's very challenging given the outcome of the German election. Chancellor Merkel is weaker after the election than she was before, but she also, one of her great political talents is her capacity to weave agreement out of disagreement. She leads in a way often from behind. But it's not going to be easy. So I think if there is a grand bargain, it's between defence and security and EMU, and I don't need to say any more about that. There is an available grand bargain. Now let me end. What is the window of opportunity that Europe faces? President Juncker talked of repair and Macron talked of rebuild. Repair, in my view, is not enough. Rebuild is the wrong metaphor, because rebuild is a sense that you can knock down what already exists. For me, what Europe now needs and what it can do, the genius of Europe is to refashion. In other words, you take the ingredients that you have and you slowly remold, reorder and refashion in a way that's suitable for the 21st century. And if I were to use a metaphor, I would say it's one of those great medieval cathedrals that were built by artisans rather than architects, and that were built over a long time and subject to change and shift, to make sure that the system goes with the grain of what is possible. And what is possible is much better than what exists now. Thank you.
I think you can sit already on the stage, because we can keep going, yeah.
Okay. Then I'll...
Thank you, Brigid. This was very rich. And indeed, if Professor Amato can join us, because as you have understood, this conference is meant to be a forum for debate, for discussion, for questions and answers. And I'm glad we have about 20 minutes to have our first round of questions. And we will have, I guess, some microphones in this hall. And if there is anybody who would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, introduce you very briefly, wait till the mic arrives, and try to be as concise and focused as possible. So please, go ahead. There's one in this first row. And actually, I would even suggest that we'll collect 2 or 3 questions, then it helps us. So next, okay, please.
Well, thank you very much for the very inspiring speeches. My first question goes, so my name is Guntram Wolf, I'm the director of Bruegel in Brussels. And my first question goes to Brigid on the grand deal that you described. Perhaps you can enlarge a little bit on how this deal would look like in your views. And my second question is to Professor Amato, which is on since you're a constitutional lawyer, on the question of the Eurozone finance minister, which is widely discussed. And in particular, I would like to hear from you how you would evaluate the idea of putting the Eurozone finance minister as a part of the European Commission. So as President Juncker has proposed this person to be the vice president. Now, I personally have a lot of doubts about it, also because of what you evoked, which is the very clear institutional separation between the Commission as the initiator of legislation, but also as the institution that, of course, gives recommendations based on the EU treaties. And then the Council and the Parliament as legislators, as well as decision makers, for example, in the Stability and Growth Pact. And I think mixing the two in one function could lead to quite a bit of institutional ambiguity, which I think will not be helpful. And I would like to hear the view of such an eminent constitutional lawyer on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I might collect at least 1 question more, so I can see. Okay, even 2 then. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question to
Take the microphone.
Mr. Amato about the Future of Europe Convention, you played a very important role during 2003 and 2004. And as we know, this constitution or constitutional treaty failed in a homeland of the president of the convent. What went wrong, according to your understanding? Why this constitution failed, and why there was no voting in the convention? This was decisions have been made in a very small group of so-called wise men, as I know. Thank you.
This was Mr. Ivar Raik from Tallinn University, and now last from microphone here, please. Mario.
I am Mario Lauristin, a member of European Parliament, and I thank you both very much for a very interesting introduction. But my question is, looking now at this rebuilding, refashioning, or any kind of changes, what is your view how European Council could be refashioned? Because looking from Parliament side, I have said that we have made a lot of progress because Parliament really have found its role, I suppose, more appropriately. But what we see that the Council is still working like it was. There is problem of transparency, there is problem of the real debate concerning negotiation between different legitimate interests of different countries, and there also the problem of the rhythm of the work, because very often we are waiting for Council decision because Council is working very, very, very slowly because of this organization thing. You know that there are ideas to have something like Senate working permanently, having permanent dialogue with the Parliament. So what's your opinion about the Council's role? Thank you.
This is not refashioning, this is
So maybe we could start answering. Maybe Brigid, would you like to start?
Well, firstly, on the grand bargain, I would say far too early to say just how grand the grand bargain will be. And in other words, will it be within the existing treaty framework or requiring beyond? And I think, given that it's unlikely that a coalition agreement in Germany won't emerge for another couple of months, we're going to have to wait and see. But if one looked at where the zone is, the landing zone of agreement might be, I would have thought defence and security is one area where you will already a lot of movement with the European Defence Fund and structured cooperation, and how much further that might go, would go, is out there. I think one question I have is what would the geographical reach of that be? In other words, who would be involved? But there's no doubt that on borders, Frontex isn't enough. On the NATO, the defence side of the European side of NATO, need for action. And then finally on internal security, because the internal security challenge is not just complex and difficult now, but it will get worse and is getting worse as you get a lot of returnees of ISIS fighters from Syria and Iraq. So that's one area. And then how much on EMU? I think you get noises about some move on the budgetary side. I would have thought that if banking union could be completed, that in a way would be perhaps the most important. But that again involves the whole debate about risk and risk sharing.
difficult without.
And difficult. Now, can I just very briefly move on to the question on the Council? Nation state to member state. Member states matter. Governments matter. The Council is an absolutely essential part of the European Union. And I, for one, have always thought that the European Council is an extremely important arena for the legitimacy of what happens in the EU. Why? Because in the European Council, you have the most authoritative political actors of their member states. They're the ones who tend to lead their parties, tend to have won elections, etc., etc. So I, for one, do not envisage or would not favour a very dramatic shift in the balance between the Parliament and the Council. I think the Parliament has gained very significant legislative powers. The area where perhaps, and this is in terms of the Parliament itself and its development, if you had a European tax capacity, however small, then that would strengthen the Parliament, in my view, because the old adage of no taxation without representation. Actually, in the EU, the problem is representation is problematic without taxation. In other words, the Parliament is not a complete Parliament in that it doesn't have a revenue-raising capacity. But on the Senate, I think I wouldn't rebalance dramatically the relationship between the European Council and the Parliament.
Okay. Over to you, Giuliano.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Brigid, on this point, because it's not enough for the European Council to be the second chamber of a bicameral legislative system. It is for the Council of Ministers to be that kind of body. And we had envisaged at the time a legislative council as the only format for the council to legislate, while the resiliency of the sectoral ministers led eventually to the decision to leave to the sectoral formats the legislative power, which makes things much more confused for people. The European Council, as Brigid has rightly said, is essential to give legitimacy from the angle of the member states to the decisions that are taken at the European level. But what the system resents is that nowadays it's not the European interest that comes first anymore. It is the European Council that decides, begins the process, and what the Commission does follows. Even regulations and directives are now prepared by a Commission which has the monopoly, following the decision of the European Council that has already decided the contents of these regulations and directives. So the 6 packs came out, and also the 2 packs, which is a little bit subversive. I'd like the European interest to remain first, but to be not authorized to reach the Parliament and the Council of Ministers without being somehow accepted by the European Council, which should come second and not first. This is the point. Going to the European Finance Minister, you are right. Here there is a clear mistake. The precedent of the High Representative, which is completely different, because in that case we had the problem of putting together the competencies of the Commission in external relations and the competencies of the Council in foreign policy. So it's quite bizarre for a single organization to have 2 sets of foreign relations, one in the Commission and one in the Council. But this is our life, and this is much worse than the hermaphrodite, because it's a 2-headed kind of creature, because my poor fellow citizens, Federica Mogherini, who is a nice woman, has to wear the double hat, which implied double heads. I mean, monster. So there is no reason to have a second monster here. And my preference goes to a member of the Commission having this function and also having the future European Monetary Fund, the EMS, transformed under its competence. This is an essential part, Brigid. In my view, it will prove impossible to complete the banking union if we don't disentangle our bank's portfolio and the national sovereigns, because this is the problem nowadays. And in order to disentangle national banks and public bonds of their state, we have to take care of this area of bonds. The European Constitution, and I finish, failed for the simple reason that it was not a constitution. It was too much for somebody and not enough for others. And most of all, at least this was my personal reaction to the fact that in the convention we had two jobs. Writing a constitution, it was a sort of decision of the convention anyhow, and consolidating the existing treaties, which was the only job we had received from the Lacan. But anyhow, consolidating the existing treaties meant writing 300 articles, which were fewer than the articles of all of the treaties that were consolidated, but had nothing to do with the 100 and something articles of the Constitution that as such was shorter than the Italian, the French and the German Constitution. But the governments, in order to have one only document to ratify, wanted stubbornly to have these two products merged in a single document, the Constitution for Europe and the Consolidated Treaty. And another monster came out, a document 400 articles, thick like this, and it was impossible to read it. And any opposer could say, this is a constitution, you can read it. This is the European Constitution, you can't even read it. I was absolutely sure of it. I and others said it, but the governments not always understand. They only understand what is convenient for them. And it's a job. It was voted upon by the plenary. No, don't think that it was a group of wise men. The group of wise men, the Presidium, made the proposal, but it was not the Presidium of the Soviet Union. It was the Presidium of the European Convention. Please, there was a democratic vote on it.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think we have time for a second short round of questions. So if there is any, yeah, I see on the very back there, and then here first. Okay. Okay, let's start from the first row then. Yeah.
Thank you, Martin Sandby from the Financial Times. Giuliano Amato talked about democratic deficits and how there are two ways of looking at them. On the input side, can I choose somebody else to represent me? And on the output side, are things working out for me? Or input legitimacy and output legitimacy, some would call it. So I have a brief question about each, and I'd like both of you to address them. On the input side, there was another idea in Emmanuel Macron's speech, which follows things he said during the campaign, a proposal for popular consultations in any member state that might be interested. But my understanding is it would be some coordinated process. So I'd like to hear your views on that idea. On the output side, surely it's right that we would like the EU better if it worked better for us. And indeed we see, as the economy has been recovering, support for the EU, support for the euro and so on go up. But I wonder if we're asking enough why the current institutions aren't delivering what they're supposed to. And if we don't know the answer to that, how do we know that new institutions will actually remedy things? If the problem is instead a lack of political will, or the wrong political incentives, or transparency or lack thereof that shape those incentives, all of those things on Macron's list that Brigid put up were basically institutional initiatives. But shouldn't we be thinking a bit more about why the current institutions aren't delivering, and what is the answer to that?
Thank you. And then another one from the last row. Yeah.
Thank you, both of you, for your insightful analysis and comments. I'm Jaak-Erik Laja, a liaison officer of the Estonian presidency of the Council, and also a master's degree from Katholieke Universiteit Leuven from Belgium. So my comment is actually about the Council, coming back a little bit to MEP Lauristin's question, but more in the direction of intergovernmentalism. So with the digital summit here, there's an increased appetite, if you might, for European leaders, heads of state, to come together more often. And with the fact that President Tusk has also seemingly taken control of devising conclusions, a roadmap for future European integration, could we perhaps talk of a renewed impetus for intergovernmentalism as actually the driving force for further European integration, which would in a sense actually be sort of unheard of? Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, that's all we can take right now. I guess you can ask eventually questions during the coffee break directly, but please, Brigid.
So, Martin, the question on input and output legitimacy, well, I will complicate it by saying input-output. There are those who argue about throughput, in other words, transparency and that. I don't give much.
They have invented the third way.
But no, I do think there's something.
We poor people had remained to the input and the output. In the meantime, they invented the throughput.
I think there is something called systemic legitimacy, and that is how we feel about the political systems we're part of. In other words, are we broadly comfortable with being part of this? And it's not directed just at what the input side is, or the output, or even the throughput. In other words, it is the level of effective attachment to a political system. And here, I think, on the EU, there's a lot of variation across Europe. And one of the underlying explanations for Brexit, for example, is that in the United Kingdom, there really was very weak sense that the EU was a good thing, that I identified with the EU on if an average of 60% of Europeans now are comfortable with being European and national. In the United Kingdom, it was 38 being comfortable with being European and national. So I think don't underestimate the importance of what I would sum up as being comfortable with. So on the input side, I think the Macron's popular consultations, if properly run, I think we know from experiments with citizens' assemblies that they are quite effective exercises in engaging with people about complex issues. And in despair, during the Irish crisis, I was part of a group where we decided we would get funding to run a small citizens' initiative in order to prove to the government that they might do this. And I was engaged in this process where we went from right across to 6 or 7 venues across Ireland, people coming out, sitting round tables, talking about taxation and things. I left that experiment convinced of the value. It was quite extraordinary because what happened was they would hear from experts, so-called knowledgeable people about the problem. And then people would sit down round a table with a mediator and have to come up with what their sense at the end of an hour-long discussion was. And it was quite transformative. People liked it. They liked being engaged, but also you ended up with people very willingly changing their minds, and it was dialogue. So I think input really matters. The question is how you can organize input in a very efficient and very, in an effective way, given the scale we're dealing with. But I certainly think more on input is necessary. And then on output, why the current institutions are not working so well. I mean, there's a very long and complex answer to that. But I would say that if you look at the challenge of governance across the world, not just in the EU. It's very easy to identify the demand side for governance, and we did. I mean, we can all come up with the list here. The problem today, I think, is the struggle with the supply. How you can match the demand for governance beyond the level of the state with the capacity to deliver it, given the dominance of domestic politics that I spoke about. So yes, institutions really matter, and they really matter in the EU, as does the constitutional and legal framework. But it's also, in my view, there is a politics trap in the EU that's deeply structural and problematic. And then on the intergovernmental, the EU, if you think back to the 1980s, to the Single European Act, which was transformative of the EU, that came out of two dynamics: a dynamic within the European Commission on the single market, and a dynamic at the governmental level. And in my view, the EU needs both. It can't be driven just by the member states. The Commission, the European institutions must also be involved. So I think that intergovernmentalism and the intergovernmental dimension of the EU is extremely important, but so too is the supranational, and it needs both.
Yeah, it needs both. The point is that no decision at the European level can be taken without involving the member states. The real difference, what makes a difference, is when the decision one way or another is within the competence of the European level, and once adopted, its legal effects are immediately produced. Another thing is when the decision is adopted at the European level, but due to the fact that there is no competence there to adopt legal acts producing that effect, you need member states one by one to adopt acts consistent with that decision. This is the intergovernmental method that appears quite ineffective in areas where the production of effects has to be immediate, where adaptation to national conditions is not needed. So this is the difference you have to care of. But eliminating the intergovernmental feature of a European decision-making process would be a nonsense and a mistake. Having said so, well, I mean, I don't think of current institutions. I think of if you reach an agreement for a better efficiency of the Eurozone, in which national levels are doing something and the European level is used for the stabilization function, you adopt the institutional reform that is needed to implement this substantive decision you have adopted. So we were discussing previously of the best for the European finance minister. If we get convinced that there are decisions that need a European finance minister, we have to introduce the European finance minister. The difference I was underlining before was between a European, let's say, conference, intergovernmental conference, that has to decide about, do we want a one-speed, a two-speed, or a four-speed Europe? Do we want to elect the president of the Commission or the president of the Council or the same figure, etc., etc.? I would say, please don't do it. People don't feel this need. This basic output, let me elect the president of Europe, this basic input is not so important. Important are other things, but these other things might require themselves some institutional changes that are, however, directly connected with substantive reforms that are agreed upon among the member states to improve their delivery at the European level. Okay?
Thank you. Actually,
sorry for you, but Brexit is Brexit, and therefore.
So we have exactly 26 minutes left for a coffee break. But before, please join me in thanking our first speakers, Brigid Laffan and Giuliano Amato. So the coffee is served just around the corner, and please be back exactly at 5 p.m. You don't want to miss this brilliant next panel session. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Nuttall from The Economist, and I'm going to start with an apology, because despite appearances, this was not supposed to be an all-male panel. We just got word literally 1 hour ago that Rebecca Adler-Nissen wouldn't be able to join us, so apologies in advance for that, but I'm sure our three male panelists will do their best to compensate. The title of our panel is The End of an Ever Closer European Union ? At The Economist, we have a pretty firm rule against using question marks in our headlines. It's seen as wishy-washy and hedging your bets and not making your opinion clear. So I'm hoping that we can use the course of the next hour and a half to get ourselves off the fence and arrive perhaps at some sort of definitive answer. It's certainly an interesting time to be asking the question. A year or two ago, further integration was not on the European Union's agenda for the simple reason that it was spending all of its time putting out fires. Monnet said that Europe would be forged in crisis. Often in recent years, it seemed instead to be sorely tested by them. The mood is a lot brighter now, and yet the question remains in some form. If you look at the visions that were expressed in the two big European speeches we've had in recent weeks, in Juncker's State of the Union address, it was todos por todos, all of the EU for all of the countries, the banking union, Schengen, the euro, the lot, with, of course, the European Commission in the driving seat. Emmanuel Macron, by contrast, placed much more emphasis on smaller groups of countries built around the traditional Franco-German core, moving ahead with others following in the slipstream if they like. Two visions of integration, not necessarily in competition, but perhaps in tension. And Brexit removes perhaps the loudest voice of skepticism towards integration, but this remains perhaps the driving impulse in places like the Netherlands or Poland. So to help untangle all of this, we don't have Rebecca Adler-Nielsen, but we do have three other excellent panelists. First of all, Chris Bickerton, who's a lecturer and official fellow at Queen's College, University of Cambridge. To his left, Luc van Middelaar, who's a professor at the universities of Leiden and Louvain, and an author. Just has a new book out, only in Dutch, but I think a translation to come. Is that right?
Yes.
Yep, great. And to his left, Pavel Sviboda, who's a deputy head at the European Political Strategy Centre, which is, as it were, the in-house think tank of the European Commission. So they're going to talk for about 10 minutes each. We'll then have an exchange amongst ourselves up here, and then we'll turn it over to you until about 6:30, after which you have dinner waiting on the first floor. So, Chris, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom, and good afternoon to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. As a UK national and somebody living and working in Cambridge, I suspect this may be one of the last invitations I get to this kind of event, so it's nice to be here for the time being. Now, I wanted to use this topic to explore something in a bit of depth, which was the impact that I think Brexit will have on trying to answer this question, on the future trajectory of the European Union and the European integration project. Now, there are different views about this, but one which is quite popular in a number of EU member states is one that was expressed by the French journalist who's been based in Brussels for a long time, who you may know, Tom, Jean Quatremer.
It's impossible not to know him.
I suspect so, yeah. And he wrote an article just the day after the referendum in the UK in 2016. And the title was, and I translate this, it was "My English Friends, Thank You for Your Sacrifice." And what Jean Quatremer was trying to communicate was this idea that Brexit would be a galvanizing force for the European project, that the EU had long been held back by these recalcitrant Brits who wanted to slow everything down, and so the federal impulse would reassert itself in a powerful way. Now, I think that's quite a comforting vision seen from within the EU 27. But there are a number of reasons why I'm pretty skeptical of that. And I want to go through three in particular, but these are by no means exhaustive. So the first one, I think, is that Brexit, or before I give the three reasons, I think we need to think of Brexit as not a singular event, but as a kind of iceberg. Now, we all know how an iceberg works. There's that visible tip, but that's not really very important. It's that big mass underneath the water that's really what matters. And I think that's what Brexit represents. And so there are three things I'd like to explore, which are the three aspects of this mass underneath the water. So less visible, but incredibly significant. So the first one is the changing nature of political competition in Europe. Now, we heard some of this in the first panel. Euroscepticism has become mainstream, but it doesn't always manifest itself in some sort of struggle between the member states and the European Union. It manifests itself much more as a slow disintegration of national party systems within EU member states. Across Europe, we have the phenomenon of voter volatility, of voter fragmentation. What we find is that political classes increasingly consider their voters with a degree of skepticism. They think of them as problems to be managed. And citizens themselves withdraw from politics, think of their politicians with a great deal of distrust. Now, the late Irish political scientist Peter Mair described this as the void between governments and their publics. And he argued that politics in the 21st century in Europe was all about how to manage this void. Now, I think the UK's referendum campaign expressed very much the dynamics of this void in UK politics. For those of us who went through that campaign, there was not a lot of discussion about the minutiae of EU institutions. It wasn't really about the EU. It was really a struggle internal to the British political system and the relations with voters and issues of distrust and cynicism that voters have vis-à-vis their politicians. So I think the void is not a British affair. This structures European politics as a whole, and I think will continue to shape the dynamics of European integration for some time to come. Now, the second aspect of this Brexit iceberg is the relationship between the single market as a set of unified rules and the huge diversity that exists in Europe in terms of national growth models. Our individual experience of the single market is by no means a common one. It is heavily mediated by the divergence of national growth models. That was very important to the UK decision to leave the EU, but it also fundamentally structures the relations that other member states have to the single market and to its rules. So in the case of the UK, we have a growth model. It's not very difficult to identify. Growth in the UK happens through expanding the labour market, boosting aggregate demand. We have very low levels of unemployment, but we also have atrocious levels of productivity with a consequent impact on wages. So the UK economy grows by expanding its labour market. That's why immigration is so important. Now, the UK's relationship to the single market was therefore heavily channeled through its experience of migration from people from other EU member states. And Brexit was a factor, immigration was a factor in the Brexit vote, not because I think the UK are particularly prone to being racist or xenophobic, but because of the nature of the way the British economy functions and works. Now, in other countries, there are other growth models. The French growth model has much higher levels of unemployment for the time being than the UK, but it also has much better levels of productivity with another impact on wages. And the French debate about the single market is not about immigration in the way that it is in the UK, but it is about posted workers. It is about infringements of the labour code. That's because it has a much more regulated labour market. So I think if we think about the forces going forward that shape the European Union, how national growth models interact with the rules of the single market will be crucial. And we learned this lesson in the Eurozone. The reason why Germany has so long been reluctant to accept the principle of fiscal transfers to help crisis-ridden economies in the South is not because Germans are naturally more mean than anyone else, but if you look at the German growth model, it's premised on great export success, but also suppressing aggregate demand domestically with a real impact on wages as well. So average Germans, over the last 10 to 15 years have not felt fabulously wealthy, even though they've had, from the outside, an incredibly successful growth model. And that really shaped the dynamics of the Eurozone crisis. Now, the UK may leave and it takes its growth model with it, but the diversity of growth models within the EU will continue to shape the dynamics of the European economy and of the EU institutions. Let me say just a final point, a final aspect of this Brexit iceberg. The UK poses a question which may seem to be only of interest to the UK, but I think it's actually of much greater relevance to the rest of Europe as well, which is whether a member state can actually leave the European Union and what that actually represents as a process. Now, we saw this title of the conference, From Nation States to Member States. What is a member state really? Why is it different from a nation state? A member state is a state whose very existence is exercised through participating in regional communities such as the European Union. The EU is not an add-on for these countries, it is a constitutive element in what it means to be a state. Now, in the UK's case, my view, and some people may disagree, but in my view, the UK was as much of a member state as any of the other 27 EU existing member states. And so the drama of Brexit is the drama of how do you squeeze in a process of 40 to 50 years of state transformation from nation state to member state, back again to nation state in the space of 2 years as dictated by Article 50. It's simply impossible. So what the UK is going through is this rapid, accelerated process of state transformation back to nation state, and we see how difficult that is and how disruptive that is. We have a very Europeanized state apparatus that struggles to imagine what life is like when it's not a member of the European Union. Now, that's not just a British affair, because if you can't exit from the European Union, then it really raises questions on what kind of union is the EU. As we heard in the previous session, it is really based on, at the end of the day, the legitimacy of national governments consenting to doing certain things. Now, if it's a community of consent, there must also be a principle, an accepted principle of managed exit. Now, if the UK really struggles to leave, if it doesn't leave in the end, or if leaving fundamentally disrupts the very workings of the British state at such a cost that it's forced to reconsider its decision, then the message about the nature of legitimacy, the nature of self-government, the nature of popular sovereignty across Europe is as pertinent in the case of Brexit as it was in the case of Greece and its position in the Eurozone crisis. So I think, just to conclude, Brexit is not a parochial British affair, but at least in 3 ways, it gives us a real penetrating insight into some of the difficulties that lie ahead for the European Union itself. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. A lot to chew over there. We'll get into it, but Luke, first of all.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Thank you also to Chris for a very dense talk indeed. And thanks to you, the audience. It's a pleasure to be here. And Tallinn has been 3 years, I think, since I came last year upon the invitation of Indrek Tarand. I think he was there over coffee. I would like to use my 10 minutes, so to say, to look on the impact that the recent crises have had on the political system of the European Union as a whole. And in terms of the question of our panel, is it the end of the ever closer European Union? My answer will be yes, but I'll get to that at the end. I will mention the 4 big crises of the past years: the Eurozone crisis, the crisis around Ukraine with Russia, refugees, migrants, as well as Brexit and Trump, which I see as one overall crisis. And obviously they all four have been traumatic, divisive, controversial decisions have been taken. They were painful. But I think together they have also revealed something about what the European Union is and how it functions in today's world. And I see this as a kind of transformation, a metamorphosis from an old Europe, which was still very much on show, let's say 10 years ago, to a new Europe, which is no longer, as the old Europe was, basically a market, sure enough with a political vocation, but which tended to think and act in terms of being a market. Of course, the euro already existed, but it was seen as a logical consequence of having a market. And even the European Union's foreign policy was seen as extending the market to the east and to the south and our values. Whereas in today's Europe, we realize, and we have realized, leaders and public opinions have realized what it really means to be not only a market, but also what it means to share a currency, to share an external border, very dramatically in the refugee crisis, and to be a power in the world, and to share also, and even in Brexit, we now realize what it means even to be a market and how dramatic that can be. I think it is possible to, there are of course many lessons, let's put it this way, many lessons to be learned from all of these four crises, but I'm going to take one each, starting with the euro crisis, which was in many respects the most fundamental one. And I think there, the European Union member states and public opinions have experienced that the reasons why we are together are not only financial and economic, but also political. Brigid Laffan touched upon this in her introduction, saying that the euro was saved because of the financial catastrophe which would have been caused when Greece would have left the European Union. Yes and no. I think this was true at certain moments in the crisis in 2010. Definitely, Greece was kept in because it would have indeed been global chaos. But there were also moments in the crisis in 2012 and also still in 2015 when the decision to keep Greece within the euro was taken in a way by Chancellor Merkel in Berlin against her finance minister Schäuble. On political grounds, because at that time in the finance ministries, also in The Hague, my own country, in Berlin, perhaps here as well, the net result of Greece departing looked manageable and perhaps even an advantage to some extent. But also then Merkel and others made the case that it was not only about money, but also about what it meant for the fate of Greece, for the stability of the Balkans, for the view of Europe in the world. All kinds of incalculable motives and reasons, which in the end triggered that final decision. So the political ground motives of being a union. In the crisis around Ukraine with Russia, which was dramatic in a very different manner, of course, and which in a country like Estonia, of course, also brings other kinds of painful memories. But I think there was also a moment of truth in that crisis, which was that the European Union, which has trained itself, and we can be grateful for that, but has trained itself to speak the language of only values and economic interests and interdependence, the European Union had to acknowledge that it was exercising power, at least in the eyes of people in Moscow. It had to, the European Union, collectively, we had to acknowledge that we are part of a geopolitical game of power, of one power against another power, of one player against another player, which we would have liked to dismiss as 19th century old-style politics, not fit for the 21st century. And European leaders, and by the way, also President Obama said it. But of course, in today's rough world, where we have neighbors as Putin and Erdogan, and I might even add Trump on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, history, in a way, is back. We no longer live in the happy end of history in which we could do our market building, but we have to organize ourselves also as a geopolitical player, which does not mean forfeiting our values, but it means being able to speak both languages. In the refugee crisis, I'll be short on that, but something comparable happened in the sense that there was also a clash between our deep values about hospitality and charity and the need to secure security and some control of external borders, and also to make sure that the incredible and dramatic inflow of 1.1 million and a quarter of migrants in a space of a few months somehow was stopped in order to avoid anti-European populists seizing power in Western European capitals. And when the EU-Turkey deal, of course, was sealed, controversial deal for many reasons, but when that deal was sealed in the spring of 2016, I think in Brussels, Berlin and Paris, people were very much already thinking about the French and also Dutch, I'm afraid to say, elections. Now, the crisis related to Brexit, there are many lessons to be drawn, and I'm looking forward to our discussion on that. But one element that comes up there, and I rely on the same Peter Mayer that Chris Pickerton has quoted as well, the Irish political scientist, is that Brexit shows that the European Union is desperately in need of more voices of opposition within the system. Brussels is a consensus-producing machine. I've been part of it. I've worked there. I have learned to speak the language. And it's good, and it's also understandable from where the European comes from, to find consensus. But over time, we are now seeing the weakness of a system which is incapable almost to accommodate for legitimate voices of opposition. Hence, people have the impression that Brussels is a kind of steamrolling machine where you don't have any grip on the decisions that come out of the machinery. Brexit, in a way, was drawing the ultimate consequence from that. It's to say, okay, if we can't have a say, then if there's no voice, then we'll go for the exit option. It also shows, of course, that the European Union as a political project has to be sustained day after day by support of public opinions. Now, these are, of course, very impressionistic observations, and apologies for that, but I think we can also draw some briefly systemic conclusions from that. One is that in all these crises, tough decisions had to be taken under the pressure of time, and about very heavy decisions. This is no longer economic interest, bickering out differences, making rules for your famous curved cucumbers, etc. This was fighting between member states, north and south, east and west, about hundreds of billions of euro in the eurozone, about solidarity and sovereignty in the refugee crisis, about war and peace and sanctions for Russia in that crisis. So there was a lot at stake. A real change as compared to the old, let's say, pre-financial crisis Europe. And that logically means that people, public opinions, voters in whatever capacity, wanted to have a say. Some wanted to say no, others wanted to say just boo. That happened in my country with the Ukraine referendum. It was just a matter of saying boo. Others also want to say yes. And Brigid Laffan reminded us of the pro-European demonstrations as a way of saying, but people wanted a say being part of the decision. I think that has to do with that the stakes have raised. And I would see that as the cause of the kind of institutional shift, if you want, from the center of gravity of political initiative, from the Commission to the European Council and national governments. It has nothing to do with personalities, it has nothing to do with the treaty, it has to do with the kind of problems the European Union is changing, the type of decisions which require indeed the highest political authority and national leaders being drawn in the European bath. That in turn also means that the phrase of ever closer union, as it always was applied to the old way of integration as a way forward, we'll probably not see that. Huh? It is a little bit of a confusing adage. Of course, it's a sacred three words, the ever closer union in some circles, but it's also a little bit confusing. And I think the strength of the European Union also in dealing with the upcoming challenges, and they have been mentioned also before our coffee break, in terms of security, dealing with Africa, dealing with borders, they will be in an intelligent interplay between what the Commission can offer and the collective political authority the European Council can provide. And I think when looking back, we will not see these 10 years of crisis as a kind of exceptional period after which everything went back to normalcy. That is an illusion. I think there will be a lot of volatile and well, perhaps exciting, fascinating events ahead, but we will go into this new kind of much more political European Union, also because the voters will ask it and have asked it so far.
Thank you, Luc. Pavel, as our representative from inside the machinery, so to speak, do you agree with this assessment that these last few years of crisis have not just been an aberration, but actually herald a completely different sort of institution, a more political sort of institution? And you come from the European Commission, which we're always told is a political commission. So give us your reflections.
I think the crisis will be remembered as genuinely redesigning the European Union, but I'm much more upbeat about the prospects, to be honest. I mean, when we look around, we have the economy at full speed, we have record employment, everyone wants to do trade agreements with us. So one should sort of avoid dragging this declinist mood which was with us during the crisis for legitimate reasons, because this was a protracted period of systemic difficulty for the European Union. But now it's different. Now I think we are beginning probably something along the lines of a decade of European promise. And I'm saying this because I see that the forces of renewal are much stronger than the forces of disintegration. So what gives us confidence? Certainly it gives us confidence that we have now been able to gaze into the counterfactual, and the counterfactual is both across the Atlantic and across the Channel. So these are the disintegration scenarios being played out in front of our eyes, and we on the continent can form a judgment on this. And clearly people don't like this. People prefer the intimacy and the stability that the European Union provides. So we've gazed into the counterfactual, that's one. But I think also we need to give credit to the positive agenda of the past 10 years, of the various reform drives that have taken place. Perhaps they have not been best managed or optimal, but they have made a difference. I mean, why is Portugal today steaming ahead? Because of labor market reforms and reforms to the business environment. So I think that shouldn't be underestimated. We should also bear in mind, my view, that the EU has come for the first time in its history under under onslaught as a project. So a lot of forces have gathered in Europe and in the world to attack or even to destroy the European Union. I mean, that has been an explicit goal. So the fact that we have survived this, I think, makes us stronger. In many countries, there is this saying that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and I think it is the case. It is the case here. The institutions have played a role. Going back to Jean Monnet and his saying that nothing is created without people and nothing survives without the institutions, I think Jean Monnet has been proven right here, because the institutions have provided an anchor of stability in a period of disruption, frankly, because we have been upended as societies on many grounds, and we have needed and we will need institutions to provide that anchor of stability. The role of the institutions have transformed. So when I look at the role of the institution where I work, the Commission, I mean, we are doing different things today than we were doing in the past. For example, we are now providing much more administrative support to the member states. This new entity which came into being last year, the the Reform Support Service, the SRSS, is now one of the fastest growing departments in the Commission. There's about 160 people. It does 150 projects in 15 different member states. That's a new type of engagement on the side of the European Commission, which sort of results from this period of the past 10 years. So we have a rich agenda. The Juncker and the Macron speeches have been referred to. I think what is different about this moment in time is that we are also shifting from crisis management to the management of our long-term challenges. And of course there is a huge world of a difference between how we approach both. In crisis management, you want to survive first of all, and then you want to preserve what you have in common. In terms of managing long-term challenges, you want to prepare for the future. So this is entirely different. In the white paper on the future of Europe that the Commission published at the beginning of March, there is that line which I think is very important, and it says that too often too much of a discussion has been focused on the binary choice between more or less Europe, and this is misleading and simplistic, says the white paper, and I think that's exactly right. It also goes to the title of this session a little bit, because the crux of the matter is in the method, is in the method of solving problems, rather than in this dogmatic attempt to search for ever more integration. So the method is changing and content is changing, and I will just want to maybe say a couple of words about both. The method is changing because we want to do fewer things, but in more important areas. So I think that has been the motto of the Juncker Commission since the beginning. It's also behind the fourth scenario in the Commission's white paper, and this is happening. It's happening in areas like competition policy, where 90% of state aid decisions are now being rolled back to the member states. And this works. It turns out that the Commission dealing with most important competition cases, while national competition authorities dealing with less important, meaning from the point of view of the EU level cases, that this type of distribution of effort works perfectly well. And we will be edging ever deeper into that scheme of things, and I think that's a response to those who wanted the EU to change. Well, the EU is changing. Maybe we are not announcing it the right way. Maybe we should be having more outspoken effort, or communication effort about this, but the EU is really changing very deeply inside. And the content is also changing, and I want to just focus on one aspect, which has to do with the social dimension. We all know that we need to grow the pie first before we divide it. But the social dimension is very important when we speak about how Europe resonates today and how it will resonate in the future. Because surely there are growing pressures of inequalities, there is growing pressure of the digital age, and Europe is responding to that, even though it's not particularly well equipped. I mean, when you read the treaty, the division of competences does not really equip Europe to deal with social challenges that much. I mean, the spending at EU level on social issues is a fraction of the spending at the member state level. So we don't have the tools, and of course no one is asking for a revision of competences. We won't do that. So we need to manage as best as we can. So what we are proposing, for example, is to have the European Labour Authority and to look after the level playing field across borders, to make sure that the national labour agencies work together, and to have the skills agenda being upgraded, because this is really fundamental if we want to address problems such as those of inequalities. So on content, there is a recalibration of the socio-economic model which Europe is taking part in. The bottom line for me is that Europe should focus on the matters on those issues where it matters, on those issues where it can be meaningful. It should avoid the trap of overpromising and under-delivering, which has been frankly part of the method since the very beginning. The method has been to announce grandiose objectives and then work your way towards something which would be reasonably satisfactory. Well, I think we need to leave that apart, and we need to move on. And finally, there is another sentence in the State of the Union speech which I find important, and it's in bold letters, and it's also in the white paper, namely that the EU should proceed at 27. So the operating assumption for this moment in time is that the EU will be a union of 27. And when you read President Juncker's speech from that perspective, it is really about this cohesion moment. It is about relaunching the EU at 27. I mean, the State of the Union is a bit of a love letter to everyone, especially to Central Europe, because there is a lot in it which is addressed directly to this region. So perhaps from the point of view of our session, there is less light on the article in the treaty which speaks about ever closer union. It's still there because we don't sort of erase anything, like you don't erase anything from the Bible. But the light shifts to Articles 2, which is about values, Article 3, which is about how to do things, which is about EU's aims. And I think we need to become strategic about this, bearing in mind that 2019 will be a moment of truth from the democratic point of view. European Parliament elections will take place just a few months after Brexit, so the citizens will give a verdict on how we jointly managed Brexit and how we managed to put forward this agenda for EU27.
Thanks, Pavel. Well, you ended by mentioning Brexit, which is where I want to resume the conversation, partly because it seemed that there was some sort of interesting parallels and perhaps some tensions between what you were all saying on that. Chris, I mean, if I understood you correctly, towards the end of your talk, you were suggesting that the difficulty of managing this exit properly, especially within 2 years, threatens the notion of a club of consent. If there's no proper way of managing exit, then how can you ensure that that consent is always there? And Brexit may highlight the difficulty of doing that. Luke, I think your take was slightly different. I think your point was essentially that Brexit shows the need to institutionalize forms of dissent inside the EU, and it perhaps highlights the fact that we haven't really had very many before. If we look at Cameron's attempt to renegotiate Britain's membership as, in effect, a form of dissent, this type of membership is not good enough, I want a different one, and his failure to achieve anything substantial, then the consequence of that, the Brexit referendum, may suggest that we may need to think about new ways to incorporate and institutionalize dissent. But Pavel, you started off by saying that I think the way that you put it was that we've gazed across the Atlantic and we've gazed across the Channel and we've decided this is not what we want. We want to do something different. And actually, rather than, as some people had suggested, the election of Trump, the Brexit referendum providing a sort of fillip to a populist like Le Pen and Wilders, actually the opposite happened. And perhaps even the high watermark of populism has been passed in some places. So maybe I can start by just drilling down onto that a little bit. Beyond that, do you think that Brexit taught the European institutions anything? What was the lesson of Brexit beyond, we don't want to do that?
I think it certainly is meaningful in the sense that, well, we have member states leaving the European Union for the first time. It is a traumatic experience. People in the Commission had tears in their eyes for about a week after the Brexit referendum. Then the way the British government reacted to it made those tears gradually disappear, if you know what I mean. But this was a rupture, of course, needless to say. I mean, we don't want to lose Britain, and we never did. But having said this, I think it's important to look at the beginning of British membership, and the lesson which I would draw from this experience is that Britain has never really socialized itself fully into the European project. It never made the European project its own, and that, together with all the British characteristics, produced the results that we are talking about. So the conclusion which I would draw, and which people are drawing in the Commission, is, well, this time it has to be different also from that perspective. Namely, we need to make sure that this is a common project of all. So if you read carefully the language of the Commission right now, it pays a lot of attention to that aspect, that it has to be a joint project. So the summit, which will relaunch the EU at 27, will be in Sibiu in Romania. Estonia leads on digital. I think there's going to be a lot more engagement from the different member states, and there's going to be a lot of invitations from Brussels to the member states to engage. Of course, not everyone will be ready at the different points in time, but I think in the ideal world, this should be a much more inclusive process. So I think that's the lesson of Brexit, which I would say already is being looked at.
Luke, if I've characterized your position correctly, how would you institutionalize forms of dissent inside the EU without simply creating legislative and political logjams?
I'll come to that, but may I add one point to what Pavel has been saying? Because I think there has been another substantive response to Brexit and to the whole, let's say, electoral revolt against the European Union and open markets, and which I think is a very wise response, and which is to say the European Union does not only need to offer freedoms and opportunities and openness, but also needs to protect. Protection is a word that has come up, well, also in speeches of President Juncker since his State of the Union in 2016. It's very much part and parcel of the political vocabulary of Emmanuel Macron, who speaks of une Europe qui protège, a Europe which protects. And I think that is, and I want to take a minute for that, because I think it's a very wise and sound way of linking two groups of voters, basically, which were also two groups of voters in the Brexit vote. The differences between the Remain camp and the Leave camp. Of course, you can generalize in all ways and different means, and always exceptions, but overall, people who liked the European Union, who voted to remain, were on average younger, better educated, had more diplomas, perhaps a little bit more prosperous. People take initiative, whereas those who voted leave tended, again, in the crude sociological distinctions, to be more on the people who stay at home. Right? It's the difference between movers and those who stay at home. In the French elections, you could see the same. And I think the European Union rightly has drawn the conclusion we should not only work for our own clients. We should not only be the machinery which creates more freedoms and more opportunities and more openness and tearing down more borders for the 50% of the people, 52 in the case of the UK, who like that. We should also take into account those other voters who may have, who may see disadvantages in all this opening, who may see foreign competitors on the labor market who may see their daily environment threatened, etc. And I think there has been a real shift, not in going all the way from freedoms to pure protectionism, but a shift, or to use a diplomatic word you just used, a recalibration, a kind of finding a new balance between offering freedoms and offering protection. For instance, on the field of trade policy, where we don't want to ape Donald Trump and go for Europe first, but nor do we want to be Europe last when it comes to dealing with China, for instance. And I think the same shift you can see in the public awareness that, okay, if we have a space of freedom, of free movement for persons, which is Schengen, and which is such a great thing, we also need to take together a responsibility for our external borders in terms of protection. So I think that is a fundamental shift, and in my mind it will help to weather a next populist storm. I don't know whether the high water point has been reached. In any case, there's now a window of opportunity, but this time needs to be used also on substance. No, okay.
I just to follow up on that. I mean, this notion of a Europe that protects, which is certainly the mantra of Macron, and I think he's conducted his European diplomacy skillfully enough to have placed it at the center of the debate that is now emerging about the future of Europe. I mean, the two examples you gave on trade and on external borders are about how Europe interacts and relates to the world outside its borders. But for Emmanuel Macron and perhaps some of his allies inside the EU, sometimes European citizens apparently need to be protected from other European citizens. So you think of his proposals for reform of the Posted Workers Directive, for example, so it's sort of a technical, obscure matter on the one hand, but the message here seems to be for Emmanuel Macron to French workers, well, I may be asking you to swallow a very difficult domestic labour reform, but don't worry, I'm going to stop the Poles from undercutting you. So that doesn't necessarily, and the Poles and, well, almost all of Eastern Europe is united in hostility to this particular proposal. So how, I mean, you say that this is a sort of a skillful way of linking these two sets of voters, but it also creates fresh fissures inside the EU, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. But I think you can also see it in terms of finding this balance. Because how can the European Union protect? Well, I think it can do so in two ways. Either it acts itself as a protector, for instance, at the borders, or, and that's the other way, it in a way stops undermining existing places of protection, such as national welfare states. And of course, the experience, rightly or wrongly, but for inhabitants of Western European welfare states has been that the European Union, via the Court of Justice, for instance, undermined or opened up these welfare states. And there has already been, well, I'm not an expert on this, I should say, but there have been some court judgments, let's say, putting the cursor a little bit more in terms of respecting also national welfare state arrangements, and not only, let's say, this opening up liberal integrationist agenda. So protecting may also mean mitigating disruptive effects of protection. Indeed, that creates new tensions. That is another matter. But I think, but that is a political judgment of the French president, that he needs to win over France again to the European cause before he can do something else. And this seems to be a very salient issue with the French public opinion.
Yeah, well, I suppose that goes to your original point, Chris, about the different national growth models inside the EU. Of course, we have different national welfare models as well. For a while, that didn't seem to be a problem. But now, when some Eastern European countries might see, as it were, their best form of protection, or at least their best opportunities for growth, to take advantage of the opportunities that the single market presents, including the free movement of people and the free provision of services across borders, when you start to hear politicians like Emmanuel Macron or others in some of the richer countries suggest that perhaps some of the national protections that they have built up are being undermined by European rules, that's when those tensions start to come to the fore. Do you think that there's a sort of a stable equilibrium between preserving the freedoms of the single market and those national protections that we are told by politicians like Emmanuel Macron are the sort of the necessary condition for consent towards being part of the single market?
I'm not sure that there are, to be honest, or that there is a perfect sort of fit that can create stability. I mean, Emmanuel Macron is an incredibly clever individual, I think, and a very savvy politician. But his combination of what he proposes to do within France, to combine that with the matter of posted workers, is comparing apples and pears. The posted workers phenomenon in France is relatively limited, very limited, in terms of its actual impact on the real experience of French people. What is overwhelmingly much more important are other matters to do with employment, to do with growth rates. So on the one hand, he says, I'm going to protect, whilst also transforming this labour market that historically has protected, but now you need to expose yourself to the pressures of labour market competition a bit more. So he takes away but gives with the other hand. He's not taking away and giving the same thing. And we have to be aware of that. And I think we need to put this discussion of the European Union in a bit more perspective here. We have European institutions that do a number of important things, but relatively speaking, we still live in a Europe of states where national governments are overwhelmingly the significant actors. As an individual, whether you're born in Sweden or in Romania or in Spain, these are decisive, as well as which class in that country you're born into. These are the decisive factors. The redistributive capacity of European institutions is relatively limited compared to what national governments can do through taxation if they have enough to distribute, which means if they're growing. So I think we're just somehow talking at cross purposes, and sometimes we exaggerate the capacities, the transformative capacities of EU institutions. I think what Macron has done is quite clever, but I don't think it's, I think he'll be judged much more on things that are to do with the French economy, its relationship to international pressures, and his specific economic reforms at home. Now, I would say, I mean, I think it's also possible to sort of be a bit too, I mean, it's nice to have a sort of some breath of optimism, which we got, I think, from Pavel. Everyone likes a bit of, you know, a bit of optimism. Nobody likes the doomsayers that tell you it's all doom and gloom. However, you know, we're emerging out of a incredibly severe crisis. The Eurozone is growing again, but for it to really sort of, you know, bite in terms of European societies, we have to talk of decades of growth. You know, demographically, the challenges are huge. If the trend growth rate for the Eurozone is, you know, 1.5 or 2%, you know, we are simply not in the age of the sort of post-war boom years of European capitalism. We're in an age of historically low growth, and that's the challenge. And that brings with it severe processes and experiences of social dislocation. What, Luke, you were talking about listening to those who aren't your sort of Euro stars, but the people who've been left behind by European integration. More than just listening to them, it's about responding to their life experience, and that, you know, is shaped by things that go quite far beyond the capacities of the European Union. We're talking about processes of deindustrialization, post-industrial economies that are organized around a service sector that simply doesn't have the ability to integrate a majority in the population. People are left behind. That creates political dislocation that we understand as this void between the voters and the politicians. So I think, yes, I mean, it's important to think about the institutional innovation that's possible. But my general impression is that when national leaders invoke European solutions, they tend to do so in a way that suggests that they are actually solutions. And it tends to avoid tackling head-on some of the really difficult problems that they face at the national level, which they do have the capacity to solve because they raise enormous amounts of revenue, and they are huge policy-making states, but they don't give that impression.
But just to dig into that a little bit, I mean, the structural difficulties that you described, the long-term economic challenges, the demographic ones, the deindustrialization, and you could name a dozen more, these are common challenges faced by most, if not all, member states of the European Union. Given that we have a set of common institutions and a tradition of of working together, forging consensus, finding common solutions to these, why the skepticism about applying that process to these sorts of problems? I mean, I think, for example, of the discussion that's now emerging around how to tax digital firms. The French and the Germans seem to have formed a common line on this, and this is clearly going to be one of the big discussions in the months ahead. That looks like the sort of issue that is almost sort of designed to be solved, or at least managed at European level, isn't it? I mean, a lot of these things, national solutions aren't really going to be the way to proceed.
Yes, and some of those are, if you look at what people say about them, actually quite popular solutions. And the argument, I think, that the European Union has very much in favour is an argument of scale. We simply cannot do these things at a national level, they have to be done at a European level, and that applies to some of these policy areas, without a doubt. However, the kinds of issues that I was talking about, which are really quite fundamental processes of economic and social transformation, cannot be done if people are not carried with you. And so the matter of what people want, what they accept, what is democratically legitimated through competitive elections, which is the way you generate political will for projects of reform, that is crucial. And I found it particularly striking that in a State of the Union address that was pitched as this wonderfully sort of optimistic and very ambitious scenario, Juncker didn't really address head-on whether or not this would mean tearing up the treaties, coming up with some fundamental reforms that mean treaty reform, and then embracing the possibility of having national referendums on all these reforms that could then garner the popular will across Europe for a new kind of EU. Now, if he's not going for that, which I don't think he is, and wants to go through some of these passerelle clauses that exist within EU treaties, it's precisely to avoid the problem of getting things ratified at the national level because they're not sure that they will get the support for it.
Yes. Well, I mean, Pavel, give us some perspective on that, because that does seem to be, at least in the short term, the perspective of the Commission. A lot of the stuff that's going to be pushed for, ways have been found to ensure it doesn't mean having to reopen the treaties and have nightmarish referendums all over the EU for reasons that everybody can understand. Is that, well, first of all, is that an accurate characterization? Second of all, is it a politically viable one?
I think it's politically viable to focus on efficiency, and this is what the proposal is about. Similarly, when it comes to the economy and finance minister, it's all about efficiency gains, which come with it, especially in the light of what is proposed with regard to EMU reform. So if there is to be a euro line. A euro area line in the EU budget, well, someone has to look after it. Someone has to look after the specificity of it. If there is a stabilization function, well, again, it has to be managed. So as opposed to having different people managing these tasks, the idea is to have a single person. Indeed, Jean-Claude Juncker proposed that that person should also chair the Eurogroup. Well, he chaired the Eurogroup for years, so he's got pretty good experience of what this is about. I think generally this is the direction of travel. Maybe not immediate, but more long term. That we will be putting the institutional functions together. So the double hatting in the area of foreign policy, I think, will be taken up when it comes to coordination of structural reform and economic adjustment, and possibly at some point at the top level when the two presidents could be merged, of the Commission and the European Council. I mean, we should be innovative, and we should be really going beyond the constraints of our traditional way of doing things, because this is also what is expected. Interestingly, the main conclusion that the international press drew from President Juncker's State of the Union speech was exactly that, namely the proposal to merge President of the European Commission with the President of the European Council, which is an invitation to debate, of course, but that was a headline in the New York Times, not anything else that he said, because everything else is our domestic affairs. Yeah. While this is what matters to the outside world, that they would have one interlocutor. So efficiency gains are really behind much of these proposals. Indeed, the idea is to move strictly within what is possible on the basis of current treaties. There is nothing that could be gained from opening a debate about treaty reform at this particular juncture. I think if it comes in the future, it will be more punctual. It will have to do with changes which are more like amendments of the US Constitution, namely small changes which are needed in order to introduce a number of ideas, but not grandiose reopening of the treaties.
Yes, well, it's not very easy to change the US Constitution.
Not any longer.
Okay, well, we'll turn it over to the audience in a minute, but Luke, just to wrap up here, I'm just wondering, I'm sort of trying to think about how Pavel's description of a sort of renewed focus on efficiency, including an efficiency of decision-making and efficiency of institutional organization, how does that chime with your description of an EU that has moved away from a sort of a market-based prism, covering everything, including foreign policy, to becoming a much more political institution that's been forged in crisis?
It doesn't chime, no. I don't think it is wise and prudent to look at institutional renovation or redesign, or however you want to call it, only in terms of efficiency. If efficiency were the criterion, we would abolish any Senate in the world and would have very small executives. I think our institutional system is complicated for a good many reasons, but one of it is that it also has to allow for a balance of powers, to guarantee freedoms, to make sure that all the voices are heard and heard at the right moment. And I don't want to go into the specific proposals, the merge, etc. I think, well, I think it would be very disruptive to merge the two presidents. It would be the end of the independent commission, and it would, in a way, undermine the very strength of the institution you're representing, and it would also forget about the need to have both an independent voice for the general interest and a place of negotiation and trust among member states, which you will need, and even the more so, rightly, as you alluded, in this new political union, where you need indeed to get your legitimacy, and I'm fully with you, Chris, on this, as close to the voters as you get. And that's why I don't fully understand the debate. I think one reason why, as I said in my introductory comments, the European Council is a center of gravity. It's precisely because the states are the place, they run the show. And what we want to do in Europe is to make sure that they all work in the same direction, that they work together, that European Union institutions also play a role there. But if you have this state apparatus with this tax levying capacity of 40%, let's say, on average, and you all work in the same direction, you can really do work wonders. Huh? Yeah. And everybody may need to do some of it for itself and in terms of its own growth model, but a lot of it can be combined and organized and put to work on the economic field, and be it digital or other, or in foreign affairs. And basically, the President of the European Commission, of course, is a member of this club of the European Council. He's another head of the executive. So it's a place where 27 soon prime ministers and the President of the Commission come together to set the general directions. And they have all their apparatus, the Brussels apparatus and national capitals, to make policy. And in terms of input, as we said before, of voters. Yes, it is clearly national leaders which are closest to their voters, and their moment of truth in terms of their electoral encounters are, of course, much harsher than that of European elections.
Okay, I think we have about 25 minutes. So, do we have a microphone? Someone coming around? Yes, I think we do. So we'll take 2 or 3 questions and then come back to the panel. So, please, over here.
Hi, my name is Matthew Karnichnik. I'm from Politico. It's a very interesting discussion. Thank you. What did strike me, though, is that it appears often in these discussions that depending on where you sit, you live in an almost parallel universe, whether it's the Commission or academia or in one of the member states somewhere. And my question is on this, especially these institutional questions and the trajectory that the Commission in particular is on now, whether you think that the current political style Commission that we've had under Juncker will survive his term, and whether that's a good or a bad thing. Certainly when you travel around the member states, especially in sort of Central and Eastern Europe, you get the sense that they would like this to be the last political commission. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In the back, here.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Chris Bickerton on behalf of the organizers for inspiring the title of the whole conference. Some of you may know the book by Chris on nation states to member states. But I would like to come back to this issue of politicization, which Luke in particular was talking about. The EU has become politically contested in completely new ways that we don't know from the history of European integration. So the question is, can mainstream political parties in the member states survive it? Can they adapt to it? What we saw in the French elections was a complete restructuring of the political landscape. What we saw in the German elections was exactly that. The mainstream parties were not at all willing to discuss EU matters, which I would say created more space than for the anti-EU radical extremist forces. So how can the mainstream parties deal with this politicization? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And take one more, right at the front, here.
My name is Paul Christoffersen. I'm a former Danish permanent representative. You sort of started out the discussion in posing the question, what can we learn from the fact that we now have Brexit? I think when most people in Brussels and in the European Council today are discussing where do we want to go, I don't think that this is on the forefront of their mind. I mean, what is a lesson you can learn from Brexit? It's an independent debate. And I don't think that, say, Brexit will be judged on what influence it might have on some of the bigger issues, which, for instance, Luc mentioned, but it will be judged on how the consequences of leaving the bread and butter work of the European Union will be felt. It will be the fact that you are standing outside the common market. It will be the consequences on the internal market. It will not be the big issues whether we combine Juncker and Tusk. These are two different debates. And I also think that maybe we have a tendency in these kind of debates to concentrate on the very sexy and exciting big issues. I do agree that on the big issues, the European Council has an enormous role to play. But I don't think we should forget all the other issues, because I think the survival of the European Union is at least as much dependent on what we do on the digital internal market, what we do on energy policy, and many of the other things. And if we are talking about, say, institutional problems, I don't think the institutional problem today is the fact that the European Council has too much to say. I think the big institutional problem which we have today is that the normal Council of Ministers is not performing as it should do, and that this essential part of the decision-making process is in need of repair.
That's a brave thing to say in the country that currently holds the presidency of the. So well done.
And for somebody who has been working 30 years for the council.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So. Three questions, or two questions and an assertion, I suppose. The first question was essentially: Will the political commission, as we're often the description that's often applied to it, will it survive the man who gave it that description? What do you think, Pavel?
I think that genie is out of the bottle. I think we will have more political elections to the European Parliament also. The Spitzenkandidaten process, I think, is there for good. What is more, I think the cross-national lists will now be a new game changer that will be added with the 2019 election.
Do you mean the transnational?
The transnational.
You think we'll see that in 2019?
I think we will see that because that's the trend which has been in place for some time.
In 2019.
I'm not, of course, the Commission is not there to decide. Yeah, of course, needless to say, the President supported the idea, but I think it could well happen, and this would be a game changer. I think this would open up a new dimension of the political European Union as well. So I think the political commission will be a legacy of Jean-Claude Juncker. Of course, one needs to understand precisely what is meant by political, and what I think should be meant by political is being responsive and having a set of clearly designated priorities. So the 10 priorities of the Juncker Commission, that was the first agenda-setting decision, and that was an expression of being political. Namely, we don't do everything, we do these 10 things. And then being responsive all the way along during the mandate. That is also about being political. Being political is also working closely with the European Parliament. Well, the Grand Coalition may not be
come on, Pavel,
there,
you work for the in-house think tank. Give us something more serious. What do you mean with political?
I think political means also taking difficult decisions, and I have to say I'm heartened by the fact that we are now seen as the big disruptor and innovator, and my good friends think tankers are taking a more conservative line on many issues, like on the institutional arrangements. So I think there is that issue of responsibility to take decisions which might not necessarily enjoy wholehearted support all around. And I think on the migration front, certainly, and now with this relaunch of the EU27, the political commission is showing, to my mind, these characteristics.
Does it also mean learning from mistakes? I mean, you just mentioned migration. It's certainly the view of a lot of member states, and plenty of people in Brussels as well, that the Commission got that wrong. And it got it wrong in particular by pushing a scheme of internal redistribution and quotas before the external flows have been reduced and properly managed. Now that debate, in a sense, seems to have resolved itself, and there's certainly consensus that you need a reduction in flows first before you can resolve the question of internal redistribution. But in a sense, it seemed that decision back in late 2015 injected a degree of poison into the system that is still working its way through, and it's one reason why we still haven't found a solution to that issue. Is it so? inside the Commission, which was pushing this very heavily at the time, is there any sense of sort of mea culpa? We got that a bit wrong?
I think we are working towards a solution which will be a lasting one. It will be more about resettlement than relocation, because the idea is to create legal avenues for refugees to come to Europe safely without risking their lives, rather than having to relocate them once they arrive on the European shores. So the most recent commitment of 50,000 resettlement places goes in that direction. Resettlement is not something you can do overnight. So you have to learn how to do it. Europe wasn't good at resettlement. 3-4 years ago, we weren't doing practically any resettlement. Yep. So this takes time, and I think we are using that time efficiently. When it comes to the original relocation decision, I think the very idea was right to focus on solidarity among member states. Perhaps the technicalities, given the pressures of the time, could have been done differently. But I think the idea of sharing the burden among 28 members is the right idea, and I find it deeply troubling that also the country I come from, Poland, hasn't taken any refugees. I have in front of my eyes Polish refugees during the war, traveling across Persia, ending up in New Zealand, and always receiving the type of welcome which now was asked for, and yet no one was taken. I think it's regrettable that this debate was very quickly politicized and became dogmatic. And we do have a very sensitive now nut to crack.
Let me put Christie's question to you, Chris, which is about the role of mainstream parties. Are they geared up to respond to some of the fresh European challenges that we're facing, or are they the dinosaurs still marching to the tunes of the past?
It depends a great deal on what you mean by politicization. And even the term political, we've bandied it around, the political commission, whereas Pavel seemed to sort of step back when it gets quite political, and you didn't really sort of say anything on this question of, whether there's a will to go for treaty change, because that's politics.
Not now, no.
Yeah, but then it doesn't sound like a very political commission. And politicization, I think, is something that people struggle to really define. Things are happening, change is taking place within European politics before the crisis and since the crisis. People sometimes throw that label politicization. My view is that it's a bit messier than that, and there are some long-standing structural features of European Union politics that haven't gone away. There's a famous distinction made by a great political scientist, Vivian Schmidt, where she says the European Union has policy, but politics are still at the national level, and there's a serious gulf between policy and politics. So you have policy without politics, and at the national level you have politics without policy. Now when you look at the way a lot of the European Union institutions work, they still operate behind this veil of, I suppose the term is actually depoliticization, not politicization. Even in institutions such as the European Council, which, as Luke said, is the sort of the clustering place where national legitimacies converge. I mean, if you look closely at the operations of the European Council and the way the heads of state meet, it's almost a little bit like a Dan Brown novel. I mean, you have something called the Antici Protocols. You have this curious game of Chinese whispers where discussions between heads of state and government are simply not written down anywhere. They're only verbally transmitted through different rooms. And the overall effect from the position of an ordinary European citizen who is not invested in these debates is something out of reach. Who knows what their minister, their prime minister or their president agreed to? How do they really know? And if you don't have, if you're not willing to make a leap of faith to assume they're negotiating in your national interest, in your best interest as a citizen of a member state, then what you suspect is that there's all sorts of compromises being made, and you don't really, so it's not even really working as a concentrating point for the legitimacy of national government. So, Christy, yes, politicization, but these long-standing trends of depoliticization associated with the process of European integration, in my view, still remain very prevalent.
So the mysterious ways of the European Council, that's what you need journalists for, of course. That's so we've got about 10 more minutes. Who wants to ask a question? At the back here.
Hello, Susanna Turunen from Finnish National Broadcasting Company. I guess my question is mostly for Luke, but be my guest, others as well if you wish. So, not too long ago, I had a discussion with a high-profile UK diplomat, and talking about Brexit, she, as an anti-Brexiter, said that, well, we might as well exit because we would have this humongous row over pretty much everything that's going on or on the table in the EU at the moment, talking about the borders, the ideas concerning migration, the quotas, banking union, so forth and so forth. So if I go back a year and think about what the European Council President Donald Tusk said in Bratislava, okay, we don't need more Europe, we need better Europe. And just a year after, everything is sort of like upside down. Macron is crying for more Europe, maybe also better Europe, or yes, better Europe. And this renaissance is very confusing because a year from now again, we might be back in Bratislava. So my question is, where are the pitfalls? If this is like a Star Wars in Europe, it's like, okay, Europe and pro-Europeans strike back. Isn't it as likely that a year from now, the anti-Europeans strike back?
Return of the anti-Europeans. Yes. Thank you. I think there was someone in front of you, I think, who had a question. Yes, maybe just pass the mic here.
Thank you. I'm Glenn Jarats from the government office here in Estonia. And once an antici, so I scribbled those notes. Anyways, we've been talking about the nation-state to the union relationship. What about the other way around? I mean, expectations of union becoming more punitive power vis-a-vis the member states. How does that change now also in the context of Article 7, Poland and Hungary? How does that change the kind of ever closer union narrative?
Thank you. And then over here.
Chris, I have a question for you on what you ended on Brexit and the EU as a community of consent. But one could equally ask the same thing about the United Kingdom as a community of consent in relation to Brexit. That was a major constitutional development. Brexit is a major, major change on a very thin majority, but equally within the United Kingdom, it clearly pits two parts of the United Kingdom against the rest. And it's particularly problematic in the context of the island of Ireland, in that the risk is not just to the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, but to peace on the island of Ireland. And I wonder whether in the context of major constitutional developments that it surprises me that over 80% of Leave voters under YouGov would actually risk peace in Northern Ireland and on the island of Ireland for Brexit. That doesn't say much to me about the community of consent that is the United Kingdom.
Thank you. And then just one at the front here.
Thank you. Sylvie Kaufmann, Le Monde. Talking about pitfalls, I was wondering, where do you think the Catalan issue fits into what you have described, the crisis you have described, and in the context also of nation states and member states? And this is apparently another scenario which hasn't been envisaged before, and where the EU doesn't have any tools to act. So how do you see this? How do you assess this crisis? Is it a European crisis, or is it still a nation-state crisis?
Thank you very much. So we'll go back to the panel. I think what I'll do, because we haven't got very much time left, I'll just go to each of you and you can respond to whichever points you like. There were four. The first, better Europe versus more Europe, revenge of the anti-Europeans. The second was this question on what role for the EU as a punitive power, particularly in the context of threats of Article 7. We had a question on the Irish issue for Brexit and the notion that peace may be jeopardised on the island of Ireland as a result of a vote that passed only in England and Wales. And then finally, where does the Catalan issue fit into all of this? So, and tie in any concluding thoughts you have as well. So, Chris.
I think I'll just try and say something very brief to the final two questions, neither of which are very easy questions. So one of the features of member states, as we can understand them, is that European Union membership is not just something that's added on, that you can opt in and out of, that is analogous to sort of an international treaty. It actually becomes, over time, part and parcel of what makes up the state. Now, in both the UK case and in the Spanish case, we've seen, I think, something like that, which is that some of these questions that have been raised about representation, about balance of powers within a single polity where you have great inequalities between regions, questions of very strong, long-standing historical identities, so essentially kind of constitutional questions, but also social and political questions, some of them quite pressing. They've not been resolved in any sort of direct way, I think partly because membership of the European Union has put them off the table. They've not needed to have been resolved. Now that's why something like Brexit poses the question quite acutely. And there's no doubt that the constitutional arrangement of the United Kingdom prior to Brexit was already in a severe state of disrepair. And the Union, as an ideological phenomenon to which people attach themselves, identify with, believe in, have real faith in, was pretty thin. So I would respond by saying this was not something that was, or some of the questions about it, whether the UK is really a community of consent or not, were already being asked before Brexit, and Brexit simply posed them in a more acute way. I think in the Catalan question something slightly different has happened, which is that we have to remember Spain over the last couple of years has been in a kind of political limbo. And the two-party system that emerged out of the post-Franco arrangement, which had existed for a long time, was for the first time seriously challenged and came apart. And you started to get a much more fragmented political landscape, which I think created a lot of space for this Catalan question to develop in ways that it hadn't been before. But in terms of responding to it, this is obviously of European concern, but I think the European Union would be it would be a very ill-judged move to get involved and to see this as something that directly relates to the European Union. This for me is a Spanish question that needs to be and can only really be resolved in Spain, rather in the same way that the future of the United Kingdom is really a question for the Union itself.
Okay, thank you, Luke. I think particularly the first question I think was directed to you, but
yeah, and it's Susanna's question on the possible pitfalls, and could we 1 year from now again be in a kind of gloomy Bratislava moment like a year ago? That was your question. I don't think I'm relatively optimistic in the sense that I don't think that the tides would turn so quickly. I think we should not forget how dark the mood was after Brexit, and especially after the election of Donald Trump, when really people were fearing that the end of the European Union was near, that Frexit, Uxit for Austria, Nexit for the Netherlands was in the cards. And I think European electorates in the past 12 months, starting in Austria, then the Netherlands, and then France, have testified, let's say, of their loyalty to the European project as such, and have warded off this existential threat for now. Now, of course, there will be other elections coming up. Marine Le Pen is not politically dead, etc. And that's why this window of opportunity to, for once, use this ugly phrase, has to be used in the 3-4 years ahead, because the populist or anti-European storm, in a way, might return. The risk or the pitfalls, of course, there are many, but they have to do with upcoming elections. They have to do with things that happen, unforeseen events, unpredictable events, and one general weakness of the European Union and the crisis politics, also in the way I described it and I experienced it, is that it was very much event-driven, emergency-driven. And what you would want is the European Union to do a little bit more in terms of foresight, strategic foresight, in terms of preventing this. Yeah. Perhaps, well, a brief remark on Catalonia as well, because of course, yes, it is a very disturbing what is happening. I think what I have observed in Brussels is a very reluctant and prudent approach to the issue from the European Commission, but also other players, also national leaders, after the images of Sunday a week ago of the referendum, continue to say that this is a Spanish issue, it's a domestic issue. Basically, our official window is in Madrid, we don't speak with Barcelona. But then already 1 week ago, the Commission did a 3-paragraph press release, which was overall very orthodox, but in the end there was one little sentence, or one sentence, also putting in the issue of fundamental rights. And it was a kind of hook with which the EU institutions could in a way claim that they also have their say in it once, let's say, in the hypothesis that violence from the state, from the Spanish state, would become disproportionate. Well, so far the reading has been, also by Juncker's number 2, Vice President Timmermans, that the violence was proportionate. And hence, the constitutional rights and fundamental freedoms of the Spanish citizens in Catalonia are not at stake. But the tension there is between, zooming out between the, let's say, the fact that the Union is indeed a union of states with their sovereign constitutional orders, and at the same time it is a union also, as Giuliano Amato said, of citizens. Even if that may be a second order category, it still is relevant, and it can become relevant when their fundamental rights are under threat. Which is my bridge to Pavel.
Well, indeed. I mean, that's a perfect segue into the one question that hasn't been answered, which was this question on Article 7. You're speaking as a member of the European Commission, but you are also a Pole, so I imagine you might have one or two things to say about that. How does that fit into this broader discussion we've had?
Well, I would say that the European Union is not designed to be punitive. I mean, let's face it. It's designed to be persuasive, and it's designed as a contractual arrangement. But of course, the Polish government has not given that line of thinking much of the benefit of the doubt. So we have been both extremely patient and willing to talk and discuss, but also rigorous on the other hand. I mean, the issue is still in front of us. The latest episode concerning the judicial reform, it is still being played out, so it's too early to say what the conclusion will be. Sometimes time needs to be given time. I, as a Pole now, search for an explanation of what is going on in my country, and my explanation is sort of more from a historical perspective, namely that until 1989, Poland and the region had one could say imposed identity. The identity really came from outside. Then with membership in the Union, it became something I would call a borrowed identity, because everything was ready. The European Union was a mature project, and these countries joined. But clearly we now see that some of them at least have not fully identified with this project, or at least not all citizens in these countries identified with the project. So now there is this moment of introversion when there is an attempt, awkward at times, clearly, to define that identity in more intrinsic fashion. So from that perspective, time needs to be given time, but of course the rules are the rules, and we need to be rigorous. So somewhere, and President Juncker has not ruled out, of course, activating Article Article 7. So let's wait for events which are happening in Warsaw, but also keeping in mind this broader perspective, which I think is crucial. Let me just say at the end a word about how much time do we have from the anti-Europeans. I mean, on the one hand, I think we have time, but on the other, I would rather not have to answer that question in the future, because I think the real question is whether we will rebuild the EU as a spacious enough house for everybody, or whether it will be a house for those of us who believe in this project, and this could be a shrinking group in the future. We never know. There's that saying in business management courses that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I think it's relevant also for this episode in the history of the European Union, that culture has become much more relevant than probably since the very beginning of this adventure. But my hope for the future would be that we manage to convince those whom we have lost, who have been attracted by others, that this proposition is a valid one for the future.
Thank you. I certainly did not think that we'd be concluding this discussion with mantras from MBA courses, but there you go. Just a reminder that we have dinner upstairs on the first floor immediately, I think. And a big thank you to you and to our panelists for an excellent discussion. Thank you.